This week, Michael faced off against his evil twin, and now we have no idea which one we're talking to, because this week, we watched Us.
Welcome back to How Did You Miss This? A show where we double take our movie watching history. I'm Evan Toller-Hickey, and with me as always, Michael Hansen and Chris Deshane. And today, we are continuing Scaretober with the most recent film that we have watched on this podcast, 2019's Us. This was the massively anticipated second movie from Jordan Peele following the 2017 just genre-changing movie Get Out. All of which begs the question, Michael, if everyone else saw this, how did you miss this?
I actually started watching it. I watched the first however many minutes. I was fully intent on watching it. I watched it when it was available to stream. I got to the scene when people arrive in the driveway. I paused there and never went back to it. So I watched a little bit of it and that was it. I now have a lot to say about like what a mistake that was, because I really should have watched the rest of it. But that's how it happened. I just paused, never went back to it, and that's it.
I love it. This is why Jordan Peele's third movie was called Nope. Michael just got to that section. He's just nope, done. Yeah. I'll come back to it in 2023. How about you, Chris?
I don't remember exactly when. I didn't see this in theaters, but I do remember seeing this, shortly after it was available at home. I was a very big fan of Get Out. That's a movie I saw a bunch of times, and so was anticipating this one. I didn't see it in theaters because I had a new little baby around the house shortly after this came out, but did see it once it was available around the house. And though I haven't revisited it since I first saw it in when it was at home streaming. How about you, Evan?
I actually saw this in theaters. I was super, super excited when it was coming out. I had missed seeing Get Out in theaters with my sort of movie watching crew that we go to theaters with, because I was traveling at the time for work, but then managed to see Get Out. I was a big fan of Key and Peele, the sketch series from which Jordan Peele comes, and so already a really big fan of his work. To see him do something as incredible as Get Out, in a genre I love so much, and really I don't feel like I'm playing it down when I said earlier that it really was a sea change in the genre. Get Out was such and remains such an important film in horror, I think. So I was so thrilled to see Us in theaters, but I haven't gone back to it since. I'm really, really thrilled that we chose this one to talk about on this podcast.
Yeah, it's certainly a deviation from what we've talked about so far in Scaretober, which are kind of more classics, or at least older. I don't know what I want to call The Lost Boys a classic, but I mean, it kind of, to your point, Evan, it's kind of this new era of horror that's come up over the last decade, where there's a little bit of a renaissance of horror, and horror movies are kind of one of those movies that you can still make on a reasonable budget that still get a return at the box office. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's the thing, like you're saying, that this is the second Jordan Peele movie. His first one, Get Out, made $250 million. And, this was his second collaboration with Blumhouse Productions. So Blumhouse Productions being one of the big, horror movie shops over the last decade or so. They're known for stuff like Paranormal Activity, The Purge, just a whole bunch of horror movies that folks would be familiar with. And they've been part of the push to really, get a lot of new horror out there. So Jordan Peele signed on for his second film with Blumhouse, and production budget of $20 million. So still a fairly reasonable production budget.
Yeah, that is definitely all up there on the screen.
Yeah,
because that is a minuscule budget when it comes to movies today. So big props.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, and like there's not. Not necessarily a ton of CGI or anything crazy going into this film. A lot of it went into, locations and talent. And I mean, there's some very practical stuff that goes into the making of this movie, filmed in Santa Cruz, including the boardwalk scene, which I'm sure we're going to touch on pretty quickly. And I think one of the interesting things about this movie too is this brings Lupita Nyong'o into kind of a front and center role, which she hasn't necessarily occupied in the same way. So she'd already won an Academy Award for 12 Years a Slave in 2013. I mean, she'd been in a number of big films, either as voice or as an actress. So in some of the Star Wars movies, in Black Panther, she'd already also been nominated for Tony. She won an Emmy the following year. So like, she's definitely a triple threat. But this is kind of one of her early leading roles, and certainly gets her a lot of acclaim for her performance in this movie, which I know we're going to be touching on as we go. And I think the remarkable thing is that from the get-go, this movie comes out March 22nd of 2019, and is pretty much straight away a pretty big success.
Yeah, I mean, like we said, $20 million budget, but in that first opening weekend, $71 million at the box office. So we're talking, third best horror movie opening ever, maybe behind It and Halloween. And it goes on to make, like Get Out, about $250 million. So massive return on investment. That said, it is not as well received ultimately as Get Out was. Basically, positive reviews for the directing and for the acting, but a lot of reservations around it just sort of packing too much into a film. I think Hollywood Reporter, says fiercely scary movie whose meaning is up for grabs. Vanity Fair says it's a joy, and it's a fun ride no matter how overstuffed. Leonard Maltin, saying when Us was over, I didn't feel a sense of satisfaction. Perhaps that's because Peele packed more into his dense screenplay than was absolutely necessary. And I think that gets reflected in the ratings. It's got a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, so crazy high there, but only a 6.3 on IMDb. So there's a real disparity with this film. It is a divisive film, I think, which makes me very excited to talk about it and, ask Michael, as the person amongst us who had missed this, are you glad that you saw this film?
I am incredibly glad to have watched this. I think this is probably one of my favorite horror movies of all time.
Whoa!
And I will probably talk about this later, but I would like to think that 50 years from now, people will talk about this movie the way that you talk about The Exorcist. I think this is a flawlessly executed horror movie for what it is. So I'm super glad I watched it.
Oh, wow. Okay. Opposite than The Lost Boys, despite there being a very obvious Lost Boys reference in this film.
Yeah, Michael having a big range here on Scaretober.
I'm loving it. So Chris, how about you coming back and revisiting this film? Are you glad you did that?
Yeah, I think this is a good movie. I'm not going out there as strongly as Michael. I think there are parts of this movie I really like, but I don't know that I love this movie. So, I think, to your point about like, it's a 93 on Rotten Tomatoes, but, I think it's one of those, like, if it's a binary recommend or not recommend, okay, that's pretty clear. But now if you're asking for like, a score out of 10, that's a different different conversation, right? So I like it. I don't know that I love it, but happy to have seen it, and I think it is definitely good for conversation, if nothing else, because there is a lot to talk about in this movie. But how about you, Evan? How do you feel after revisiting it?
Well, I'm thrilled that we revisited it for this podcast, because coming out of the theater after originally seeing it, I was like, okay, that was good film with some really good performances in it. There's a lot to chew on. I think I'm sort of with the reviewers on that. It did feel kind of packed. That said, revisiting the film, this film has grown on me tremendously. I think that this is one of those films that really, really benefits from rewatching. And I think Michael is right that 50 years from now, people will be looking back, and while this didn't get that kind of love as much that it maybe deserved off the jump, I think that as people go back to this movie and keep unpacking it, they're going to find more and more and more to enjoy out of it. So big thumbs up from me.
Well, there you go. So we'll take a quick intermission, and on the other side, let's talk about it. Spoiler warning here. As usual, we're going to get into everything about the movie Us. If you haven't seen it, then be warned. We will talk about all the stuff. And if you haven't seen it and don't want spoilers, then run away. So if you don't know what happened in this movie or need a recap, well, while the Wilson family is on a family beach vacation, they encounter sinister doppelgangers of themselves. These menacing lookalikes in red jumpsuits embark on a night of terror, and throughout the movie, we discover that there's a shocking connection to the real Wilson family. So, this movie, I mean, as Evan touched on up front, Jordan Peele, both familiar with horror and comedy at this point. And I think in Us, we see him combine both those horror elements, the humor elements, and of course, social commentary, which very much expected and anticipated out of all his movies now. So I'm curious from both of you, how do you feel that Jordan Peele pulled that off in this movie?
It's funny you ask that, because I didn't think about the comedy. Like, there are some really funny lines. I think that this is primarily a horror movie. I think it does that extremely well. And I think that in terms of like balancing the type of writing, I think this is an amazing idea for a story, great twist, and great lines in terms of chemistry. I wouldn't have thought about balancing horror and comedy, because I think it is ultimately a horror movie that has like some laugh out loud moments. Which I suppose is a long way of saying I think it balanced it really, really well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Michael, in thinking that it balances it very well. I think that Jordan Peele is absolutely masterful at knowing exactly when to put a laugh for either juxtaposition of what's going on. For instance, when Elizabeth Moss's character says, call the police to their voice assistant, and NWA's Fuck the Police comes on, mwah, chef's kiss. And in the theater, that went over so well, and everybody is just cracking up at this really terrifying, awful, awful moment. But at the same time, he knows exactly when to have a laugh to release tension as well. And that's where horror and comedy goes so well together, is that it gives you that release that a jump scare could also give you without having to do the jump scare. So you get that cathartic release. And he's so good at doing that. When it comes to social commentary, I mean, I think that's where all of the reviewers and myself on that first viewing were like, okay, there's a lot here. And watching it that second time and being able to really unpack it and think about it and watch it through that lens, that commentary on inequality is so powerful to me, and it sets up that very much that there, but for the grace of God go I kind of thing, where it's like, I could so easily be that tethered person, or I could so easily be that person, who lives in poverty, who, lives on the very rough side of America, who is at the bottom of the social hierarchy, but through some either accident of birth or through something very deliberate, here I am living this kind of, middle class life that is all about keeping up with the Joneses and all about materialism and all about killing people with golf clubs and boats.
There's two parts of there, and I think in general the social commentary in this movie obviously poignant. Like, I think it's a very important and effective message. I know Jordan Peele in particular was talking about like how like he fundamentally believes that, any of our successes ultimately aren't just juxtaposed against other people's, privation or whatever, that where they don't have the same privileges, but also in fact is like, our benefits come at the cost of someone else. Like there's almost a zero sum game in the way he's kind of talking about the making of this movie. And I think, that comes across very clearly with, the tethers and the duality of those kind of roles and existences. I will say the humor for me in this movie, like he knows how to get a laugh. He knows how to make humor great. And I will say it does a good job for me of looking at, so if you look at the dad, I think there's humor in him trying to like confront the family at the end of the driveway, because at some points he does a great job of setting up the like, it's funny when you can tell he's trying to like man up. Hey, I told y'all to get off my driveway. And it's not the least bit intimidating at all. And I think there's some really great humor built into a very tense moment. I do find at times that it deflates the scene a little bit for me too, when I love the scare rather than the humor, though. I think that's the thing for me in some of those scenes where it takes a little bit of the air out of the balloon on the tension for me.
I think that we're getting back to that kind of overstuffed sort of idea here as well, because that moment I think is so good when Gabe confronts the family of tethers in the driveway. And at first it's like, hey, are you lost? Like, what are you doing here? Get off my property. And then he does a very, very deliberate code switch. And he goes from being sort of like, okay, I'm using my like middle class, university educated, because he's wearing his Howard shirt, for big chunks of this movie. So it's like, okay, he's gone to a very good school, but then it's like, okay, we gonna get crazy. And it's like, oh, that's so interesting that he is flipping into, a different kind of mode of speaking to scare people off. Well, in hopes of scaring people off. And boy, does it not work at all. But it's, again, that social commentary, that duality, and one could again think of the inequalities that are happening there as well.
But I think as well, like up to that point, if you knew nothing about this movie, that is the pivot. Up to that point, it could have gone either way. He goes up there and is like, look, I've been really cool with you guys. I asked you to leave. I really need you to walk away. And that could have gone, they walk away. It could have become a home invasion movie that would have been scary, or it could have done this other thing. But that's the pivot point. So the humor kind of like, it goes up to that point. But from that point on, I don't think that we see that anymore. I don't think we see like the ridiculous humor. I don't think that we see like, because up to that point, things are normal and you have certain roles in the relationship. Beyond that point, it's like, whoa, that took a turn. And then I think it is very consistent from that point on. Personally, I think it works super well, because it turns into something like, okay, now we're dealing with this whole other thing. And for me, that worked super well.
So yeah, it's interesting because there's a few things in there where, during the home invasion where he's like, you can take my money, you can take the boat. And the daughter's like, nobody wants the boat. I'm like, okay, I get it. Haha. Like it's funny. The NWA thing, like the fuck the police thing. I'm like, okay, I know voice assistants are terrible and I yell at mine all the time for getting it wrong, but okay, that's played for a joke. Like, what's the right way to put this? It's kind of like when we were talking about The Exorcist, where I'm like, there's just a few too many like wink, wink, haha kind of moments here and there for me where I like this scare and I find that the laugh goes down a different path maybe some of the time than what I'm looking for. But let me
agree to disagree.
Well, and so this is where I was going to head next is just, you know, like for each of you, how scary is this movie? Like, you know, does this really stand out as a scary movie? And, you know, are there any scenes in particular that stand out?
This movie scared me shitless. I thought this was entirely frightening. All kinds of reasons. There were jump scares, there were creepiness, there were the themes, there was the... Actually, I want to talk about this for a bit. The way that they kind of cut away from some of the outright bloody stabbing at some points was almost scarier than if they had shown it, because it just leaves so much more to your imagination. So for me, this was an utterly frightening movie, way more than something like The Exorcist. Watching it now, forget 50 years ago, but like watching it now, I was like, this was a thoroughly scary movie.
Which parts of it are the parts that like scare you and creep you out?
Everything. I thought the initial thing around the mirror funhouse, I thought what they did with the power outage the first time, seeing the people, the voice of the mirrored shadow person, what I call the other mother, everything scared me about this movie. Everything made me feel like, whoa, I am at the edge of my seat.
That's so interesting to me because I actually don't find this a particularly scary movie. I just love watching it. I am 100% there for the ride, but it's not it feels, for me, it's a much sort of more tame ride. And I think it's because it's not the kind of horror that really freaks me out.
Yeah.
You know, like ghost stories and things like that. That's much more in the realm of the things that really frighten me. And this just goes to whatever it is that like gets at people for horror. And that's what makes it such a cool genre. Yeah,
I totally get it. Like it's like you like the mechanical head turning around and the green pea soup spitting out and throwing up on people. Like I get it. Like that's scary for you.
That's
thought
just
this
a normal
was
Tuesday for
entirely right. I thought this was entirely frightening. So yeah,
I mean it's interesting because I mean Jordan Peele talked about it, saying that like for him, like the idea of a doppelganger is one of the most terrifying things. Right. And he's like, you know, it's an upsetting thing for me, you know, like seeing myself in the mirror kind of thing. Right. And so I think for me, there's two scenes which I find genuinely scary, like that great level of tense. One is the opening boardwalk scene with the little girl going through the House of Mirrors and whatever. And then when she sees when she turns around and the mirror doesn't turn around, you're like, oh, okay, that's a great moment. And the home invasion between, you know, there's a family at the end of our driveway through to like when they start kind of like running and trying to save themselves, like that's a very tense, scary, you know, sequence. I found myself through the second half of this movie not feeling the tense, creepy crawlies or whatever, you know, throughout that second half. And so it's the interesting kind of like balancing act of what creeps you out and what kind of tension keeps you on the edge of your seat. Cause I found the second half wasn't really that, you know, that tense, that tight for me.
It's a really good point because it's like the comments you had about the pacing for The Exorcist are sort of here in reverse.
I agree. Yeah.
Because you have like I wrote down, I joked about it before we started recording. I said about like a Venn diagram between Jacob's Ladder, Sixth Sense, and Coraline. And then I had plus action. So there's a thing here that they go after where you have this interesting intersection, plus it's an action movie. So if you like that, like I did, I thought it was amazing. If you don't like it and you want something more slow paced like The Exorcist, it's going to be like, well, I don't get it. The last third is just, it's not for me. But for me, it's just like, I thought this was an incredible new evolution of a of this concept, and I was all there for it.
Well, I think one of the things that really helps drive the whole thing forward, can we talk about some of these performances? Because there are some moments, like some of the scariest moments for me in it. And again, like, I don't find this a particularly scary film, but, Lupita Nyong'o as Red, and the way that she is so mechanical in her movements is wonderful and scary, but also as Adelaide, just in trying to save her family and in the sheer terror of the moment. But also a massive shout out to Elizabeth Moss, who I think delivers one of the most disturbing parts of the film for me, when she's putting on the tether is putting on Kitty's makeup and then takes the scissors and starts slicing her own face. That is just so effective. I love it. I mean, I think the performances across the board in this film are phenomenal to me, but big shout outs to those two women.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they definitely stand out. I mean, especially, the difference between Adelaide and Red, for Lupita Nyong'o and the two characters she plays, who are just so dramatically different. I mean, I agree with you. Elizabeth Moss, both her, her death and her creepiness afterwards are very good, but like, just the huge variation on those two characters played, essentially in the same scenes throughout the movie by Lupita Nyong'o are just, great. She's great in this movie. And
yeah, this is really true, like, masterclass in acting, watching her do what she does so well. And so difficult to carry a film like this, especially when you're playing the good guy and the bad guy. And she does it just like seemingly effortlessly.
I couldn't agree more, because it's not just that, it's like the good and the bad, but it's like, as we'll talk about later with the twist, it's good and the bad and the good and the bad again, in a way. I thought that she did an incredible job, and there was no one in this one, in this movie, where I thought like they did a terrible job. Everyone did their role extremely well. And I also think there are a bunch of things that I didn't appreciate until the end, like all these little breadcrumbs around acting, little things that they did, little flashbacks they did, that then later you go like, oh, very similar to, like, I already played my hand talking about Sixth Sense, where, at the end you go, oh, so that's what that red color meant throughout. I thought they did an incredible job doing all these things. I felt very natural at the time. And then later you go, oh, that was really good.
So, Michael kind of touched on it there about there's a bunch of little breadcrumbs and Easter eggs throughout this movie. It's definitely one of the things that this movie is known for. So were there any particular little, references, hidden clues, other stuff that was adding to your viewing experience as you watched this?
Well, I think that is exactly what elevated this viewing experience for me rewatching this film. It's kind of like what Michael was saying about Sixth Sense, and then knowing the twist on that and then rewatching it and going, oh, all of those things. Or for me, the reference that I was like, oh, this is like rewatching Fight Club, which is just like, which is a great movie, but better on the second watch, because you are picking up all of these little things. In terms of the Easter eggs, I have to say that the one that really made me go like, oh, that is such a tight piece of writing, is when Gabe is talking to his daughter Zora and is like, hey, you should run while you're here. And she's like, yeah, no, I want to drive. And it's like, that will come back in such a great way. Also, huge shout out to Shahadi Wright Joseph, who plays Zora, because her creepy smiling tether person.
Yeah. Umbre.
That is terrifying. The creepy smiling tether person that she plays is so unnerving. So big thumbs up. But like, yeah, like that little bit of dialogue, I was like, oh, damn, like that is tight, like just great.
I loved all of these little things. Like even from the very, very start, the hands across America tethered together, like that, and then you know this is going to be important somehow, but you don't know how. And then later, when you see in modern day with the sun coming out of the washroom and seeing the man on the beach standing arms outreached, you get that's important, but you don't exactly know how. There are all of these little things. The dad renting the boat, and it veers to the left, and the motor. Like there are all these little things that you go later and go like, oh snap! Like everything kind of links back, and you go, that is amazing. Sorry, for me that was incredible. I just loved. And that was in one watching where I felt satisfied that it all linked together. Like compared to some other movies where you say, oh, you really should watch this 10 times with your friends over the next 15 years. For me, this was satisfying in one watching. And I was like, that's brilliant.
I can't wait for you to watch this a second time, Michael.
Yeah, I mean,
I really, really cannot wait for you to watch this a second time.
There are lots of little goodies. I think, I mean, some of the stuff that I think is easy to notice is, as that, Hands Across America plays, when you immediately also start getting drawn to the stuff on the bookshelf around it, you notice that there's like the Goonies, Chud, which is cannibalistic human underground dwellers, all sorts of little like 80s references, which obviously tie into the whole, underground dwelling tethers. And I mean, I think for us, one of the important ones that we have to call out is the, on the boardwalk scene in the beginning, when Adelaide's there with her family, and the mom turns around and is like, oh, hey, they're filming a movie over there. And it's like, well, yeah, they're filming The Lost Boys. So, I mean, this is.
And what happens to Adelaide?
She gets turned
gets
into a vampire
lost.
by David, who is also Ace. I'm just trying to see if we can turn this into a full connection of all the movies we've watched. But definitely an easy 6 degrees of Lost Boys on this one, because it's not even, it's 1 degree. But I will say also, Michael, to your point about some of the bread crumbs that you can, trace back through this movie. It's some of the stuff too, like Adelaide whistling Itsy Bitsy Spider in the beginning when she's going through the House of Mirrors. And then when Red comes back, she also whistles Itsy Bitsy Spider, which kind of gives you that like, oh, there's something more here. Who is really the good one and bad one? And again, it's like, do you see that on the first watching? Maybe, maybe not. Do you see it on the second? I definitely did. It's going to be interesting to see, what else you can pull out if you rewatch this again.
Was that your favorite Easter egg, Chris? That little itsy bitsy spider bit?
So I think one of the ones for me actually that I didn't really think about until I rewatched it was why Red's voice is the way it is. So she can speak, but like, I didn't really think about it on the first one. I'm like, she's just a weird creeper person. Maybe she's the king of or queen of the tethers. And so she learned to speak, above worlder. But like when you actually think about it and it's like, oh, the little girl was strangled in the first scene. Maybe it did damage to her throat or right. Crushed, and that's why. So I'm like, oh, rewatching it. I'm like, oh, okay. That's a clever, choice about how that character speaks and why they speak that way, which maybe you don't pick up on, on the first viewing until you can connect those dots. So I really appreciated that one, especially as it helps flesh out that character so much.
I agree. And it also makes sense too. This was something that I was like, oh, that's weird the first time I watched it. And now the second time really picked up on is when, the tether, well, I guess Adelaide is pulling her the actual little girl through the tunnels. Why, and locking her up? Why she isn't screaming? Why she doesn't call out for help or anything when she gets like handcuffed to the bed? And it's like, oh, okay, right, because she has no voice right now.
Yeah, this movie is definitely full of lots of little Easter eggs and fun little surprises, but it's also full of lots of twists. So I think it's time for a quick intermission. And on the other side, we can talk about all those twists and turns that made this story go from start to end. So Us is a movie that's definitely full of twists throughout, but it can definitely feel like the ending and some of the themes can be very open to, interpretation. I don't know that you necessarily get a nice clean bow tied up as you go through this thing. So I'm curious about how both of you feel about, the overall story in this movie.
So I was going to almost paraphrase something you said in a previous episode to say, like, I agree with all of that up until the point where you said no. Because everything you said, it's like, that's actually a selling point for me. That's not a negative thing. It's like, it's a lot of themes, it's a lot of things going on, and you have an ending that for me was a very, very satisfying. So I think we're going to have a little bit of a debate here. Like, I think the twists worked for me extremely well, and it made me more interested in what's happening after that final scene. Like, I not that they're going to do an Us 2, but what actually happened after they drive off.
Us also,
yeah. Or you, them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, Michael. It's a selling point to me too, that there is so much to pick apart. I think we've realized over the course of doing this podcast, I really like picking apart things, the symbolism, the little hidden things, working out how the story structure happens. I think that, Chris, to the question of how do I feel about the overall story, I think that the overall story is very strong. I think that narrative from beginning to end works really well. The sort of setting it up from the beginning with that text about all of the tunnels in the US really kind of gives you that sense of like, whoa, like, okay, so how is this all going to work? This sounds really weird. And then you've got the shots of the rabbits and you're pulling back, and it's very off-putting and very strange. And it's making you go, okay, there is weird stuff at work here. And then you jump into what, seems like is going to be like kind of sweet. But it's an amusement park at night. And as we've talked about in The Lost Boys, like that gets creepy. And then we have a really great scene that we can keep coming back to that doesn't show us exactly what happened. And I think that all of that breadcrumbs really, really well all the way to the end. I think that the thing, like we said, that the people keep stumbling on is just how much symbolism there is, how much social commentary there is, that it can feel like it sometimes gets in the way of the actual narrative itself. But again, selling point for me, and it seems for Michael as well.
What I like about the story is this is a really original idea. The whole notion about the underground world and people who live there and the shadows, the reflections. This is a new thing that I had not seen before. So crazy kudos for that. On its own, that's incredible. Then the writing is incredibly good in terms of dialogue and how people act together. I really like the twist at the very, very end. I think that's great. So for me, like all these things come together extremely well on their own. Then I think I can really, really see how people would bring in their additional views about social commentary and issues on top of that. And that that's probably fair in terms of what you bring yourself, what he felt when he wrote it. But without that, even on its own, I think it is an incredibly strong story and how they deliver it. So on its own merit, for me, that was outstanding.
Yeah, and let's not forget, too, that people aren't just sort of like bringing their own kind of ideas about social commentary into this film. This is the film that follows Get Out. And that is so clear in its racial commentary. And, how, white America loves black bodies and fears black minds.
So what you mean is the last movie you made sets the tone for the next one you do. Because you did this, then therefore that. Like, because Spike Lee this, then he couldn't make Inside Job. Like, I have an objection to that. So social commentary might be inferred, but I don't think that is explicit in this. The thing that I was surprised you didn't say, because I want to talk about it, is one of the funniest scenes in the movie. I wrote down, it was like, they have just killed the other friend family. And I'm like, are you insane? Like, you're calling the cops? It doesn't occur to you that they're going to show up and be like, what did you say happened here? You have killed this white family and you're sitting here in their home. That to me is more social commentary than anything. And I was shocked they didn't do a thing, but that would have been lazy in the movie. When I watched this, I had seen Get Out when it first came out. I watched this fresh. I didn't necessarily look at this as a continuation of a particular theme. I watched this as a standalone. This is a really interesting horror movie that has great plot and great themes and great undertones. But I didn't carry forward from the previous movie some of the themes that went with it. So I know we've talked about and heard about other commentary around themes and social issues and race, but none of that kind of occurred to me as I watched this. I was able to look at it on its own merits and really, really enjoyed it. And maybe if I went back to it, maybe I would pick up on different things. But I just think that on its own, the movie on its own, I think carries tremendous weight, and I would recommend it on those merits to anyone.
I agree with you, Michael. I think that the movie does definitely exist on its own merits. What I was sort of getting at was that you've got an audience that has a set of expectations coming in. Now, luckily, you've had time between Get Out and us, and you're watching it, without carrying in that presupposition or those expectations of like, oh, okay, here's a second horror movie from Jordan Peele, and it stars a black family, and well, this is definitely going to be something about like racism in the US, because Get Out was about racism, and that wasn't entirely delivered for an audience looking for that. It is about inequality, not necessarily about race. And I think that maybe diminished some people's enjoyment of it, only because they went in with a set of pre-existing expectations for what they were going to get.
I'll just say that I think, I think to your point, Evan, going into this, you're kind of expecting like, all right, Jordan Peele makes movies that are probably going to be scary and have something to say. Okay, great. I'm ready for it. The antenna is up for what am I seeing here? I think for me, when we talk about like the overall story, I think the social commentary that's baked into this is excellent. I think, to your point, it stands on its own merits. I find the last third of this, probably everything after they leave the other family's house, I find the ending really soft. So yes, there's a twist in there, but like I find getting there is kind of arduous for me. I think the point that's being made, and I think maybe where some people struggle with it, is I don't think it's quite as, explicit as in Get Out.
Yeah, it's definitely not as pointed.
And so sure. I think there's a lot more like ambiguity in this, which is maybe where people don't necessarily, it's to your point. It's that like the difference between thumbs up, thumbs down review versus point score, like we were talking about earlier, right? Like, is it a Rotten Tomatoes or is it an IMDb, and where are they? And I think that's for me where, like Michael called it out earlier, like this is the reverse Exorcist, which could either be a really upsetting sex move or what I think about the plot of this movie. It's definitely front loaded for me in terms of the pacing, the tension. You definitely get the that kind of commentary through the first half, 2/3, as you're like, okay, there's these two different people doing the same thing, and one is the fortunate and one is, the have and have not kind of thing. For me, I think the movie struggles in that final third to tie a lot of the stuff that they've introduced up, and that's where I feel like it kind of bogs down. And to Michael's point, it becomes a little bit more of an action movie than a horror movie for me, a thriller maybe, or that kind of thing. So I think that's where this movie struggles a little bit for me, which I still think is a great movie. And I think the story and messages are incredibly compelling. It just, I don't know, it flags for me a little bit in that last half.
So I've got a question for both of you. In terms of movies that we have watched already, would you say that this is maybe closer to like Vertigo, just in terms of the way that it is cinematically constructed? And I wonder again if this is one of those things where Michael is absolutely right. In like 50 years, we'll be talking about this movie still, because watching this film felt like a cinematic feast for me, in that, again, there's so many Easter eggs, that the costumes are so good, the acting is so good, the shots, the framing are really interesting, like and have something to say with the story as well. Like, for instance, the overhead shot of the family walking on the beach and their shadows coming off them, and it's like, oh wow, this shot is a great shot, but it is also a shot with something to say. Wardrobe with something to say. The black flag shirt on the carny, and the black flag shirt on the twin, talking, getting you in that sort of like consumerism, materialism sort of bent. The use of music and things like that. I wonder if this is going to be one of those sort of like Vertigo kind of movies, one that is appreciated much more later on, as like as Michael sort of said when we recorded that episode, like a bit of a film class movie. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
It's an interesting question. To your point, there's definitely some moments, like when Red is holding Adelaide down on the glass coffee table, and the glass, splinters, and it's, splinters directly between their two reflections in the glass, and you're like, okay, there's a severance between these two now. Before they were tethered, and now, okay, cool. Like there's some interesting shots. I think there's a lot of interesting foreshadowing. I don't know how people are going to feel about anything in 50 years, but I do wonder whether a movie like Nope, his 2022 movie, which was not as well received, might be more akin to the Vertigo, which was, pooped on at the time. Whereas I think this was incredibly well received for lots of different reasons. So I'm wondering if, maybe that same kind of like critical recognition and that kind of thing might be more akin to Nope, which is a really interesting movie also. But I don't know. Maybe if in 50 years we're still doing the podcast, let's revisit it.
Yeah, but look at it this way. So this movie for me was incredibly powerful. I thoroughly enjoyed every aspect of it, and I thought, wow, that's brilliant. And I think I played my hand so many times throughout this series to say, I really respect movies that do something that generate that reaction. Other people might hate it. You come in with different expectation and you have a different reaction. That's okay. But at least you have some reaction, as opposed to a blah movie like what I felt about Lost Boys. So for me, everything clicked. I didn't come in with this movie didn't have to carry all this weight on its shoulders of, well, you had this previous movie and you have to live up to the legacy. You have to do all of that. Like going back to The Sixth Sense, who can do that? Who can live up to those expectations? This was just a movie that I thought was really, really good on its own. Terrific storyline, great acting, great characters and dialogue, great twists, and also on top of that, I think rewards multiple rewatches. Like, what more could you ask from my perspective? So, like,
well, I think you're right, Michael. Like, I think especially when you look at Jordan Peele's work, like to have a movie as unexpectedly sensational as Get Out, an original, piece of writing, and then follow it up with another piece that is both so interesting and compelling as Us, and equally as successful as your first. Like, it's not common that you can have two original, pieces of intellectual property come out one after another from the same writer director and both be, having an incredibly strong message and incredibly well put together, incredibly successful, like all of those things. And then also to follow it up with Nope, which was still successful, just not as well regarded. But I mean, it's like Jordan Peele is definitely a guy who, when he comes out with something new, you're going to be like, okay, I'm interested. I want to know what this is. I want to know what he's making. One of the things that he also does that is interesting throughout this movie, kind of tying into some of those commentaries and Easter eggs that we've already kind of touched on, is the soundtrack and the sound design throughout this movie. Like, how effective did you feel it was in terms of tying into the story and creating some of that atmosphere and tension throughout the film?
I have it written down in my notes that the score is almost like, again, to go back to Vertigo, the score is almost Bernard Herrmann-esque. Like, it is at times a very classical Hollywood score. And I think particularly where I really felt it was in the in that scene where Elizabeth Moss is putting on the makeup. You've got these like classic Hollywood strings happening, and it's so cool. And such a neat juxtaposition from just listening to NWA shortly before. There's also there's just really good music choices. Like, there's Janelle Monáe, there's Beach Boys. Like, it's really good. And the music in the scene between Adelaide and Red at the end, where they're fighting each other, the underscoring of that is just pitch perfect for the sort of, violent ballet that they're doing to each other.
I really agree with you in one way. I think the music for this was very, very powerful. The blend of this stuff always seemed so suitable to the scene, whether it was like when they're just hanging out in the car and driving, or whether it was the original kind of like the Mirror Funhouse music going on. And like you said, that 50s type of music with the Elizabeth Moss scene, unbelievable. I thought it was just like a perfect pick. Where I disagree is like, I think that in Vertigo, the music actually didn't leave me with much of a, like, I thought it was mismatched at times. I didn't have the same feeling at all. Here, I thought all the music hit the spot. Like, I thought it was a great pick for whatever was going on in each scene.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. I mean, I kind of touched on some spots where I found like some of the, like the NWA thing or whatever, poked a little bit of a hole in the tension balloon for me in some of those kinds of moments. But like, by and large, like, I think the music is interesting. I think it's appropriate for the points in time too, with like, the dad, and I Got 5 on it. And he's like, it's not a song about drugs. It's a great song. Don't do drugs. And I'm like, okay, yeah. I have those moments with
which is great. Exactly. That's a great scene.
Yeah. It's a great scene, and it's appropriate. And like, I heard, Jordan Peele in an interview say like, there is something kind of creepy a little bit about that song too, just the way it sounds. I'm like, yeah, I actually find that too. So when it comes back in the end is kind of that part of that sub theme in the ballet where you can have some of those same notes playing through. I'm like, yeah, it's definitely creepier when it's done here too. But generally, yeah, like I think especially for me, kind of tying back to where I found creepy, like the sounds and music in the in the glass, in the mirror house, in the fun house, like creepy, tense the whole way through. In the home invasion, creepy, tense, when the glass breaks, ooh, I'm, start a little in my chair. So definitely well done there. I mean, I think this, movie is ultimately pretty great. And I think the question for each of you, which I don't think is going to be any surprise at this point, is like, is this a movie that you would recommend to somebody who hadn't seen this?
100%.
This is my favorite movie of all the movies we've watched so far. Like, I think this was brilliant in every way. So again, caveats around horror movies, et cetera. We didn't talk enough around the rating of this. I think they did a genius thing that made it possible to recommend to more people for some of the violence things, but maybe fewer people because of some of the themes. But 100%, I would recommend it to anyone who's up for this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. This is a great movie. If you have not seen this movie, it's definitely something that's worth a watch. I mean, to what Evan and I were saying, and though Michael sounds like he disagrees a little bit, I don't think this is as scary a movie as some of the other stuff that, like The Exorcist. It's not as disturbing in some ways as The Exorcist. I also don't think it's necessarily as, gory or whatever as some other movies as well. There's definitely some moments in here, but like if you could watch Get Out, then you can certainly watch this as well. I think it's definitely a movie that has, things to say that are important for us in 2023. So if you've missed this, then by all means, it's something that's well worth the watch. Do you two think you will be revisiting this anytime soon?
I think I probably will soon. I don't know. We've got a lot of movies to watch, but as I said earlier, this is a film that really benefits from rewatching. So I would also say to anybody that I recommend this movie 100% to, watch it a second time too. Watch it a third time. This is a really well constructed piece of cinema. Go enjoy it and break it down. Have fun deconstructing this because you will be rewarded. This is a film that it really, really asks for that and delivers on it.
I will come back and watch this again, probably more so than something like Get Out, because this to me, like I said, half jokingly, but it's like this perfect intersection between Sixth Sense, Coraline, and Jacob's Ladder. Like it really kind of hits that, strikes that note for me that I really like. So for me, this is going to provide a lot of enjoyment coming back to again and again. So I look forward to watching this again.
Interesting. Yeah, for me, this is probably not a movie I'm picking up again now that I've seen it once before and then watched it twice again now. Not to say I think it's a bad movie. I just don't love it. And I think, it partly for me is on rewatching this movie. I remembered two scenes, the creepy, funhouse at the beginning and then the home invasion. And I forgot the rest of the movie because I kind of don't love the rest of the movie. So for me, I'm not sure I'm picking this up again, though I think what the movie has to say is absolutely at least worth, one watching. But, I'm not in love with it, but I got the message and that's great. So if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth it there. If you have already seen it, then, I
totally rewatch it 2-1.
Well, there you go. I've been outvoted, it seems, but that's what we thought about Us. And we'd love to know what you thought about this movie. You can always email us at howdidyoumissthis@gmail.com. You can send us any questions that you might have that you want us to cover on something that we are going to be watching, or you can let us know what you thought about the movies we have watched. And while you're out there on the internet, do us a favor and take a second to rate, review, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening. And we'll be back with you next week when we'll be continuing Scaretober and watching Hereditary to see if we'll lose our heads or if this is a movie that should stay missed. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you then.